Chantal Mauduit stood on the summit of K2, the killer mountain, and could not see anything. She had been blinded by insanely high levels of ultraviolet radiation. Now she had not the slightest chance of descending from an altitude of 8,600 meters on her own. There was not a single soul around. In a panic, Chantal hid in a snow cave and was slowly dying. Would anyone come to her aid? Would someone sacrifice their own life to save the Black Widow of mountaineering? This is the story of the infamous French alpinist Chantal Mauduit, who spent her entire life balancing on the razor's edge. When Chantal was 5 years old, her parents moved from Paris closer to the Alps, and the girl developed an interest in the mountains. At the age of 15, she began mountaineering, quickly earned a mountain guide certification, and conquered the most difficult routes in France. At 22, Chantal took third place in ice climbing competitions, surpassing Europe's best climbers, every single one of them men. After that, she was accepted into the French Federation of Mountaineering and Climbing, and the name Chantal Mauduit became well known in the mountaineering community. However, no one in that community could have imagined what was hidden behind her sweet smile. When Chantal summited Huascaran, the highest peak of the northern Andes, at nearly 6,800 meters, she descended by paraglider. One of the climbers was so impressed that he immediately invited her to take part in an expedition to Everest. At the age of 27, Chantal decided to conquer the highest mountain in the world. Although the attempt was unsuccessful, she decided that from then on, she would climb only 8,000-meter peaks. She had the necessary skills and training, and she adapted superbly to high altitudes with all their challenges. But there was another distinguishing feature: her beauty. Chantal was attractive, sociable, cheerful, open, and without a doubt, sexy. At that time, mountaineering was still a predominantly male domain, so the beautiful Frenchwoman attracted a great deal of attention in the climbing camps. And, without question, Chantal actively used this power. She enjoyed driving men crazy and even provoking them. During her second attempt to climb Everest, two climbers were so desperately seeking her attention that they challenged each other to a duel and began throwing stones. But Chantal gave attention only when it benefited her. She never carried a heavy backpack. Instead, she took a toy duck with her. Everything she needed was carried by men. And now, let's do a bit of math. Mountaineering gear alone weighs between 10 and 15 kilograms. If you add clothing and food, the weight increases even more. And since this was an ascent of an 8,000er, the climbers also had to carry oxygen cylinders. The higher you go, the lower the air pressure and the less oxygen there is in the air. The body has a harder time absorbing it. After passing the 8,000-meter mark, there is so little oxygen that the body can no longer function properly. It quite literally begins to die, cell by cell. This zone is called the death zone. Once you cross it, you cannot rest, no matter how much time you spend standing still. Here, people lose their sanity due to hypoxia, cold, and despair. Now imagine you are a climber who has been ascending an 8,000er for weeks. Cold, snow, constant discomfort, and exhaustion. And on top of that, someone is loading you with extra kilograms because they do not want to carry their own gear. Despite Chantal's behavior, men adored her. And one American climber named Thor fell head over heels in love with her. Surprisingly, Chantal returned his feelings. If only Thor had known what a high price he would pay for this romance. For the time being, however, they were dating and planning a joint ascent of Mount Fitzroy in Argentina. It was an expensive expedition, so Chantal even led several mountain tours to earn money. Before their departure, she unexpectedly announced that she did not have the money for her ticket. Thor, madly in love, took a job as a courier and earned enough to cover the travel expenses for his beloved. But as soon as the couple set out on the journey, Chantal's attitude toward Thor changed resco. She barely paid any attention to him. Thor did not understand what was happening and continued trying to win her heart. But with each new failed ascent, things grew worse. When Thor was already close to the summit, he could barely move while hauling all the gear. His muscles felt like lead, and all of his clothing was completely soaked. At 11 p.m., Thor reached a difficult section near the summit. He grabbed onto a rock, but suddenly felt it begin to move. The next moment, the rock slipped free and started rolling downward, heading straight toward Chantal. Thor had only enough time to shout a warning when the rock suddenly severed his rope, and he was sent tumbling down. He struck the rocks several times, but was fortunate to land on a ledge 20 meters below. Thor was alive, but his face was badly injured, and his right arm was broken. Fortunately, other climbers quickly came to his aid and brought him down to base camp. But what Thor learned at the camp was an even greater blow. Chantal announced that she no longer loved him and would attempt the summit with another team. Broken both mentally and physically, Thor returned home and began to recover. But he could not forget Chantal. When she planned an ascent of K2, Thor immediately began looking for a place on her team. K2 is one of the most dangerous and technically challenging mountains in the world. Its height is 8,611 meters. There are several routes to its summit, but all of them consist of near-vertical walls of ice and rock. At that time, only 3 women had managed to reach the top, and, of course, Chantal wanted to become the 4th. She joined a Swiss team that had received a permit for the ascent. However, almost from the very beginning, Chantal put her participation in the expedition at risk. The team's route began in Pakistan, a Muslim country with strict rules. There, women are forbidden to go outside without a male escort and to wear revealing clothing. Chantal, however, completely ignored these rules. This was not only a sign of disrespect toward local customs, but also a threat to her life, as she was a foreigner. Nevertheless, as before, Chantal managed to reach K2 base camp quickly and without consequences, where she was met by Thor. He had joined an American-Soviet expedition that included the best climbers of that era, among them Ed Viesturs and Scott Fisher. However, Chantal did not even glance at Thor, preferring instead to entertain herself with other men in the camp. After acclimatization, both teams began their ascent on parallel routes. The Swiss team and Chantal planned to climb in alpine style, meaning without using ropes or other aids. When they decided to attempt the summit, a storm forced them to stop. But Chantal had no intention of turning back. According to Pakistani law, changing teams during an ascent was forbidden, and Chantal was forced to descend. But Thor offered her to join their team, and she agreed. The man was confident he would get a chance to win back his beloved. But Chantal began a romance with Ed Viesturs and, according to rumors, not only with him. On July 28th, the climbers gathered and started moving toward the summit in small groups. Thor, Ed, and Chantal reached Camp 3 in 2 days, but the weather on the mountain was extremely unfavorable. Ed decided to return with the other climbers, while Chantal and Thor stayed alone. Despite continuing to ignore him, Chantal made him carry all of her equipment. This proved physically impossible. Thor was forced to abandon almost all of his gear, including both sleeping bags, ropes, and most of the food. Only then was he able to continue, though it no longer mattered, as the summit was still far away and night was nearly falling. They had to spend the night right in the snow. In the morning, Thor began to suffer from frostbite on his feet. He could barely move, but he decided to descend to retrieve a sleeping bag. The only thing he heard from Chantal was her demand to take her bag. Still in love, Thor obeyed. On the way back, he met Alexei Nikiforov, who had joined them on the ascent. After another night under the stars, the three reached Camp 4. From there, the exhausted Thor began to forge a path toward the summit through a 50-centimeter layer of snow. Every step at that altitude literally drained their strength. Just 200 meters from the summit, Thor realized that his energy was completely spent, and his only chance of survival was to start descending immediately. Chantal tried to dissuade him, but fortunately, he did not change his mind. This decision determined the fate of all three climbers. Meanwhile, Chantal and Alexei continued the ascent, and on August 3rd at 5:00 p.m., Chantal conquered K2. She stood on the summit, intoxicated by success and blinded. During the ascent, she lost her sunglasses, and the sunlight reflected from the snow caused corneal burns, nearly blinding her. She had no chance of descending on her own. No partner, no satellite phone to call for help. In a panic, the disoriented Chantal miraculously found a snow shelter dug by other climbers and simply hid inside it. But it was not salvation, rather, it was her future grave. Without a sleeping bag, Chantal began to freeze rapidly, and the death zone continued to drain her last remaining strength. It seemed like the end. However, Chantal was miraculously found by Nikiforov, who was descending from the summit. He could not leave her to die, but by that point, most of her extremities were already frostbitten. She was semi-conscious and kept falling asleep while moving. Helping someone in such a condition descend from the summit of K2 is a titanic task, capable of turning into a suicide mission at any moment. Especially when Alexei and she reached the bottleneck of a narrow couloir, looming with massive ice block seracs. At any moment, one of them could collapse directly onto the climbers. But even this was not the most serious problem. Alexei had no chance of descending without a rope, let alone carrying Chantal, who was unconscious. As it turned out, Alexei had discarded his rope on the way up. But she was found by Thor, who had already passed this section and had fixed a rope at the bottleneck to make Chantal's descent easier. Alexei grabbed it, but as soon as he started moving, one of his crampons came off his boots. He lost his balance and began sliding down the steep slope toward the abyss. The rope set up by Thor saved him at the last moment. When Alexei reached Camp 4, he was on the verge of death from altitude sickness, physical exhaustion, and cold. He literally collapsed into the tent that Thor had set up, who himself was barely alive after a long stay in the death zone. But Alexei was alone. As it turned out, at some point, he had let go of Chantal, allowing her to descend on her own. After 45 minutes, Chantal appeared on the slope with her arms outstretched, like a sleepwalker. Thor dragged her into the tent, began warming her feet, and fed her hot soup. But none of this brought relief, because the climbers were still in the death zone, where the body is incapable of recovery. 3 days passed, and Thor realized that time was running out for all three of them. They would either descend or die. And so they went. But in 3 hours, they had covered only 60 meters. Here it's 3 fighters. Frustrated, Thor began setting up a tent, while Alexei continued the descent alone, though he was physically at his limit. The next morning, he contacted Ed Viesters and Scott Fisher by radio, asking for help. They replied that they were already on their way. Thor breathed a sigh of relief, but he did not yet know what was about to happen. At the moment when the two climbers left camp, they were roped together and began ascending. Suddenly, Ed felt goosebumps run over his body, a sense of inevitable doom. Soon, he started sinking into the snow, surprising his rope partner. Just a second later, Scott also realized what was happening, but it was too late. A wall of snow was moving straight toward them. Ed managed to take cover in a small cave he had dug, while Scott was swept away by the avalanche down the slope. The rope stretched between them, yanked Ed out of his shelter and dragged him along. He drove his ice axe as deep as possible, hoping to stop the slide, and he succeeded. Now, the two climbers who were supposed to be rescuing others were themselves dangling just meters from the abyss. It was a moment of pure terror, and none of them believed they would survive. But they managed to get out, brush themselves off, and continue the ascent. When they met Thor and Chantal, the two were already near death. It took 2 long and grueling days to transport them back to Camp 1. Amazingly, by the end of the descent, Chantal's condition had improved so much that she was able to walk on her own. She was welcomed as a heroine. She basked in the attention of the men, telling the story of how she had conquered the summit, how her eyes hurt, and that was it. Thor was shocked and clearly had a different opinion about what had happened on the mountain. Chantal definitely wouldn't have descended without me. I don't believe she would have survived, he said. Alexei also added his criticism. He claimed that Chantal had, in fact, not reached the summit, yet the climb was officially credited to her. After this incident, the French woman was nicknamed the Black Widow in the mountaineering community. It became clear that she had no regard for the mortal danger she dragged men into, men she used for her own purposes. It seemed that she didn't care about any rules at all. After being fined for illegally changing teams, Chantal tore up the documents and threw them in the official's face. Despite all this, she continued to enjoy enormous success and secured funding for future climbs. She had several unsuccessful attempts to conquer Everest. In 1995, Chantal tried again as part of a group organized by mountaineering legend Rob Hall, a commander of the Order of the British Empire and a 5-time Everest summiteer. However, the expedition with him turned into yet another scandal. Chantal proved to be the slowest in the group and held everyone back. At an altitude of 8,750 meters, her lips turned blue and her gaze became unfocused. Rob ordered her to return to camp. She nodded silently, took a few steps, and lost consciousness. Once again, the entire team risked their lives to save Chantal, including Ed Viesters, who saved her life for the second time. And as before, she recovered very quickly and was back in the camp the next day, joking and laughing as if nothing had happened. Outraged by such irresponsibility and ingratitude, Rob declared that Chantal was from then on banned from participating in his expeditions. He never realized that by doing so, he had saved her life once again. The following year, he led another group on Everest. At the same time, Chantal attempted to conquer the nearby peak, Lhotse, which no woman had yet climbed. However, the Himalayas were hit by a terrible storm. Most of the climbers abandoned their ascent and took shelter from the storm. But Rob Hall and Scott Fisher could not be saved. They died on Everest that day. Unaware of this, Chantal descended to base camp and announced that she had conquered Lhotse. But since she was alone, there was no proof. And with her already questionable reputation, many climbers did not believe her. And even knowing all this about Chantal, the end of her story was still unexpected. In 1998, Chantal and her Sherpa friend, Un Shring, were at Camp 2 on Dhaulagiri. An Italian team of climbers warned her about a dangerous crevasse, blocked the route, and left. Chantal thanked them and closed her tent. 5 days later, when the Italians returned, they saw Chantal's tent in the same spot, half buried in snow. When they dug her out, it turned out that both climbers inside were dead. Chantal had a broken neck, and the Sherpa had suffocated. It was assumed that they had been crushed by an ice block, but no one saw it happen. and it cannot be confirmed. What really happened to Chantal is unknown, but most climbers who knew her were not shocked. No one was surprised that she died. She ignored her own safety and the lives of those around her, behaved as if rules did not apply to her, and the mountains do not forgive those who underestimate them. Who was Chantal really? A true Black Widow, or a talented climber striving for absolute freedom? That's all from me. Thank you for watching. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. Support the video with a like and subscribe to the channel. Take care of yourselves. See you next time.